What if Hamlet was never trapped in a kingdom, but inside a question that never stops rewriting him? Because the moment you assume his problem is Denmark, or Claudius, or revenge, you're already missing the real structure underneath. The real conflict is not external. It is the moment a mind becomes aware of itself, and can no longer stop watching itself think. And here's the disturbing contradiction: the more clearly Hamlet sees the world, the less clearly he can move inside it. Why does intelligence, in its purest form, begin to feel like paralysis? Because Hamlet is not reacting to events like a traditional tragic figure. He is constantly reinterpreting them. Every signal becomes a question. Every intention becomes a hypothesis. Every truth becomes unstable the moment he looks at it too closely. And that is where the breakdown begins. There is a moment in his mental structure where thought stops being a tool and becomes a loop. A loop that keeps asking, what is real? But never accepts the cost of answering it. This is not hesitation in the ordinary sense. This is cognitive over-awareness. The kind that turns action into risk, and certainty into illusion. And here's the first memory fragment you need to hold on to: the silence of Elsinore is not peace, it is hesitation stretched across an entire system of power. A kingdom that waits because one mind cannot finalize itself. But let's escalate the scale for a moment. If Hamlet is simply a man delaying revenge, the story is small. But if Hamlet is a model of consciousness collapsing under self-reflection, then the entire tragedy becomes universal. Because now the question is no longer what should Hamlet do? It becomes, what happens when a mind cannot stop analyzing itself long enough to become action? This is where the contradiction sharpens. Hamlet is not ignorant. He is not naive. He is perhaps the most perceptive mind in the entire structure. And yet that perception does not liberate him, it fragments him. Every insight generates another layer of doubt. Every conclusion immediately becomes unstable. It's as if truth itself refuses to stay still inside him. And that instability spreads outward. Memory. Fragment, the ghost of the king does not resolve truth, it introduces ambiguity disguised as certainty. A command that feels absolute, but behaves like a question. So now the system is infected. Not with lies, but with interpretations of truth that cannot settle. And this is where the real psychological shift happens: Hamlet stops living inside events and starts living inside his interpretation of events. That shift sounds subtle, but it is catastrophic. Because once you live inside interpretation, reality becomes secondary. Consequences begin to emerge quietly at first. Relationships weaken. Timing collapses. Decisions are delayed not because he lacks information, but because he has too much conflicting meaning attached to every piece of information. Even action starts to feel like a philosophical risk. But here's the deeper layer, the one that destabilizes everything you think you understood. What if Hamlet is not failing to act, but refusing to act in a system where every action feels like it might be wrong in a different way? That question reframes everything. And once that reframing begins, there is no return to simplicity. Because now the tragedy is no longer about revenge, or justice, or even morality. It becomes something far more unsettling. What if consciousness itself, when turned inward completely, begins to erase the possibility of certainty, and with it, the possibility of action? And if that is true, then Hamlet is not a broken prince in a decaying castle. He is the first visible collapse of a mind that learned too much about itself to continue living inside reality without questioning it. But then the greater question emerges, one that does not resolve, only expands. If self-awareness leads not to clarity, but to fragmentation, then what does it actually mean to know yourself? If we go one layer deeper, the real question is no longer why Hamlet hesitates, but what kind of mind structure makes hesitation feel like the only responsible action? Because from the outside, it looks like delay. From the inside, it feels like responsibility. And that contradiction is where the entire system begins to fracture. What happens when every possible action generates its own moral doubt? The mind stops choosing. Not because it cannot decide, but because every decision feels incomplete in advance. And this is where the context shifts subtly but permanently. Hamlet is no longer responding to a single conflict. He is now operating inside a system where every interpretation generates a second interpretation, and every certainty immediately creates its own counterweight. A loop without closure. Here's the first escalation. The external world of Elsinore begins to lose its function as reality. It becomes raw material for analysis. Not events, but data points. Not people, but variables. Memory fragment. Polonius, once a political actor, becomes indistinguishable from surveillance logic itself, speech turned into monitoring, conversation turned into extraction of meaning. But what does that do to a mind like Hamlet's? It amplifies everything. Because the more the world behaves like a system to be decoded, the less it behaves like a place to act inside. And here comes a crucial insight: Hamlet is not losing connection to reality. He is gaining too many layers of it at once. Each layer feels true. Each layer contradicts the other. And none of them can be fully dismissed. So what do you do when truth stops being singular? You hesitate. Not as weakness, but as overload. But here's the contradiction that destabilizes everything: hesitation itself begins to generate consequences faster than action ever could. Because in a system where delay exists, time becomes an active force. It doesn't wait. It accumulates pressure. Memory fragment. Ophelia's emotional collapse is not an isolated tragedy, it is a downstream effect of unresolved signals, of meanings never stabilized in time. So now the cost of thinking multiplies. Not internally, but externally. Every second of analysis reshapes the emotional and political environment around Hamlet. Silence is no longer neutral. It becomes causation. And this is where the revelation begins to surface: Hamlet's mind is not just interpreting reality, it is actively generating instability through interpretation itself. The more he thinks, the less stable the world becomes. But here's the deeper inversion: this is not a flaw unique to him. It is the logical endpoint of a mind that refuses to accept incomplete answers. Scales shift from a single prince in Elsinore to a universal model of cognition under infinite self-reflection. Now the consequence becomes unavoidable. If thought produces instability, then clarity requires limitation. But limitation feels like ignorance. And ignorance feels like moral failure. So the system locks itself in place. Not because it is broken, but because every available option feels ethically incomplete. And that leads to a quieter, more dangerous realization: Hamlet's paralysis is not absence of will, it is excess of competing wills inside one consciousness. Each version of him argues for a different future. Each one believes it is correct. But none can finalize control. And this raises a deeper mystery: if identity is not singular, but a collection of competing interpretations of self, then who is actually responsible for the decision not taken? Or more unsettling still, if every act of self-understanding multiplies contradiction instead of resolving it, what kind of self are we actually trying to understand in the first place? The deeper you go into this structure, the more unsettling the question becomes: what if the real conflict was never about understanding reality correctly, but about the fact that the mind cannot stop producing competing versions of reality at the same time? Because at this stage, it is no longer about hesitation as a behavior. It is about contradiction as a permanent condition of consciousness. And that changes everything. Inside this mental architecture, every conclusion is immediately shadowed by another conclusion that denies it. Every moral judgment creates a counter-moral judgment. Every interpretation of truth generates a second interpretation that destabilizes it. So what does a mind do when agreement is impossible even within itself? It begins to fracture into roles. Not personalities in a theatrical sense, but functional versions of thought competing for control of the same decision space. One version demands action. One demands caution. One demands moral purity. One demands existential honesty. None can fully eliminate the others. And this is where escalation begins. Because indecision is no longer neutral. It becomes structural pressure. Memory fragment: the silence inside Elsinore is not absence of communication, but overload of unfinalized meaning, where every spoken word carries more interpretations than intention. So now the external world begins to reflect internal instability. But here is the contradiction that deepens the crisis. The more Hamlet tries to unify his understanding, the more divided his internal system becomes. Unification produces fragmentation. And fragmentation produces delay. And delay produces consequences that cannot be reversed in the same timeline that created them. This is not simply psychological tension anymore. This is a feedback loop between cognition and reality. Scale shift. What begins as one individual mind now behaves like a prototype for any system where interpretation is more powerful than action. And once interpretation dominates, reality stops being primary. It becomes secondary data waiting to be reprocessed. Memory fragment. The ghost figure no longer functions as a source of truth, but as a destabilizing input that never resolves into a final meaning, only generates branching possibilities of obligation. So now every attempt to obey clarity produces more ambiguity. Every attempt to simplify increases complexity. And here is the turning point. Hamlet is no longer asking what is true. He is trapped in the more dangerous question of what truth is allowed to mean before it becomes irreversible. That shift creates a new kind of pressure. Because meaning is no longer passive. It has consequences. Not symbolic consequences. Structural ones. Relationships begin to lose stability because every interaction carries unspoken alternative interpretations. Emotional bonds weaken under the weight of analysis. Even silence becomes a form of communication that must be decoded, and therefore can never remain simple. And here is the escalation point. When everything becomes interpretable, nothing can remain stable long enough to become action. So the system does what all overloaded systems eventually do. It stalls. Not because it lacks information, but because it cannot prioritize between equally valid interpretations of that information. But this is where the real contradiction becomes visible. A mind designed to understand deeply becomes incapable of choosing simply. And a world that demands action begins to collapse under a consciousness that refuses to accept incomplete certainty. Memory fragment. Ophelia's emotional disintegration is not caused by a single event, but by repeated exposure to unresolved meaning that never stabilizes into emotional closure. So now consequence is no longer delayed. It is accumulating in parallel with thought itself. Every moment of reflection adds weight to outcomes that have not yet been decided. And here is the revelation forming at the edge of clarity. Perhaps the true tragedy is not that Hamlet cannot act, but that action itself requires the death of all alternative interpretations at once. To act is to erase possible meanings. To understand is to preserve them all. And those two processes cannot coexist indefinitely. Which leads to a final instability emerging at the center of everything we have examined so far. If every interpretation contains partial truth, and every truth generates contradiction, then what does it actually mean for a mind to choose one version of reality and commit to it without destroying the others? And in that moment, the system begins to reveal a possibility that has not yet fully formed into certainty. At this point, a more disturbing question begins to surface beneath everything we have examined so far. What if the breakdown we have been attributing to overthinking is actually the natural result of a mind that has finally reached the limits of unified identity? Because the system is no longer just producing contradictions. It is revealing something structural about consciousness itself. And the revelation begins here. There is no single Hamlet making decisions. There is only a rotating set of internal positions, each generated by a different requirement of truth, morality, emotion, and logic, none of which can fully silence the others without violating the integrity of the mind that produced them. This is not fragmentation as failure. This is fragmentation as architecture. And once that becomes visible, everything shifts. The mind is no longer a singular decision maker. It is a negotiation space between incompatible truths, each demanding priority, each carrying its own version of legitimacy. Memory fragment. The Elsinore silence is no longer hesitation, but the audible result of competing internal authorities reaching no final consensus. So what looks like delay is actually unresolved governance inside consciousness itself. And here is the deeper insight that redefines the entire structure. Hamlet is not confused about what is real. He is trapped in a system where multiple realities remain logically valid at the same time, and none can be eliminated without loss of meaning. That changes the role of truth itself. Truth is no longer a destination. It becomes a constraint system. And under that constraint, every possible action becomes partially wrong from at least one internal perspective. Which leads directly into consequence. Because once no action can satisfy the full internal system, non-action becomes the only form of coherence left. Not because it is chosen, but because it avoids collapsing one interpretation in favor of another. Memory fragment. Ophelia's emotional collapse reflects not a single tragedy, but the overflow of meanings that were never stabilized into one shared interpretive reality. Now the scale shifts again. What appears as a personal psychological conflict begins to resemble a model of any complex system under excessive interpretive load. A system where inputs are not missing, but overabundant. Where clarity fails not from lack of data, but from too many valid readings of the same data. And in that environment, certainty becomes impossible without reduction. But reduction feels like distortion. And distortion feels like betrayal of truth itself. So the system freezes. Not from ignorance, but from overcompleteness. And here is the turning point revelation: the real invisible force shaping everything is not indecision, but the refusal to destroy alternative meanings in order to act. Because action is not neutral. Action selects one interpretation and erases the rest. And for a mind structured like this, selection feels like loss of reality itself. Which means every decision carries existential cost, not just practical consequence. And now the deeper implication emerges: perhaps Hamlet's tragedy is not that he cannot act, but that he understands action too accurately. He sees what it destroys. He sees what it excludes. He sees what it simplifies. And that level of perception does not produce freedom. It produces containment. Memory fragment. The ghost figure no longer represents truth or illusion, but the impossibility of stabilizing meaning into a single authoritative form. So the system becomes self-enforcing. Every attempt to resolve ambiguity generates further ambiguity. Every attempt to finalize understanding reopens the question of what was lost in that finalization. And now we arrive at a critical scale shift. This is no longer about one mind in a castle. It becomes a blueprint for any consciousness capable of reflecting on itself without limit. A mind that can see itself too clearly begins to lose the ability to decide without contradiction. And that raises the final question forming beneath all others: if every act of understanding requires the elimination of competing truths, then is clarity itself a form of destruction disguised as insight? And if that is true, then what exactly is being sacrificed every time a mind finally decides to act? At this deepest layer, the question is no longer about fragmentation, hesitation, or even conflicting interpretations of truth. The real question becomes far more unsettling: what if the structure of a thinking mind is not designed for final agreement with itself at all? Because once every perspective inside a consciousness carries partial legitimacy, the idea of a single correct decision begins to collapse. And in its place, something else emerges. The core revelation is this: Hamlet is not suffering from indecision. He is suffering from the absence of a hierarchy inside truth itself. There is no internal authority capable of declaring one interpretation more real than another without simultaneously violating the integrity of the rest. Every internal voice is both valid and incompatible. Every moral system inside him is complete in isolation, yet destructive when forced to coexist. So the mind does what any unresolved multi-system structure eventually does. It stops choosing. Not out of weakness, but out of structural necessity. And that is the hidden architecture beneath everything. Memory fragment. Elsinore is no longer just a political space, but a reflection chamber where every action returns as multiple meanings, none of which can be dismissed as false. Once that is understood, Hamlet is no longer an individual in conflict with a kingdom. He becomes a consciousness trapped inside a system where truth has no final governing layer. And here is the expansion of that insight: intelligence, when pushed beyond a certain threshold of self-reference, stops producing clarity and starts producing branching realities that cannot be reconciled without loss. This is why every attempt at resolution feels like betrayal. Not betrayal of others, but betrayal of alternative versions of meaning that also feel correct. So the cost of certainty becomes visible. To choose is to erase. To act is to silence competing truths that still feel alive within the same mind. Memory fragment, Ophelia's collapse is not only emotional tragedy, but a structural echo of what happens when meaning is transmitted without stabilization, when interpretation becomes heavier than reality itself. Now the consequence expands beyond Hamlet as an individual. This is no longer psychological. It becomes systemic. Because any mind capable of deep self-reflection eventually encounters the same limit, the point where awareness multiplies perspectives faster than they can be unified into action. And at that threshold, identity stops behaving like a single continuous entity. It becomes a negotiation between incompatible but equally coherent internal models. So what we call self begins to look less like a subject and more like an unresolved system of interpretations temporarily held together. Scales shift from one prince inside a castle to a universal model of consciousness encountering the structural limit of total self-awareness. And this is where the philosophical weight becomes unavoidable. If every act of understanding generates competing versions of truth, and every version of truth carries its own moral legitimacy, then the collapse of decision-making is not an exception. It is the expected outcome of full cognitive transparency. Which means the tragedy is not that clarity fails. It is that clarity succeeds too completely, exposing too many valid worlds at once for any single action to preserve. And now the deepest implication surfaces. Perhaps the mind was never meant to hold all its interpretations at the same time without hierarchy. Without selection, there is only simultaneity. Without hierarchy, there is only paralysis. And without paralysis, there is only the loss of complexity. So the system is trapped between three irreversible losses: action, truth, or multiplicity. And none can be fully preserved alongside the others. Memory fragment, the ghost figure now represents not guidance, but the impossibility of compressing truth into a single directive without destroying alternative meanings. So the final consequence is not collapse in a dramatic sense. It is suspension. A state where every possible meaning remains alive, but none can become final enough to act upon. And that leads to the final philosophical fracture. If consciousness is defined by its ability to hold multiple truths at once, then is the inability to choose not a failure, but the maximum expression of awareness itself. The consequence is no longer contained within a single mind. It spreads outward like a structural echo, reshaping everything it touches without ever announcing itself as destruction. Because once a consciousness reaches the point where every interpretation feels partially true, the world around it can no longer remain stable in a single form. What remains after that is not resolution, but residue. A kind of cognitive aftermath where decisions exist, but never feel fully justified, and truths exist, but never feel fully complete. And this is where the true consequence becomes visible. When a mind cannot finalize meaning internally, it begins to externalize unresolved meaning into its environment. Memory fragment, Elsinore is no longer simply a court under political tension, but a space where uncertainty itself becomes the dominant force shaping every interaction, every silence, every delayed response. From this point forward, Hamlet is no longer just a participant inside events. He becomes a generator of interpretive instability. Every perception he produces multiplies into additional layers of meaning that cannot converge into a single outcome. And that is the silent transformation. Not collapse, but diffusion. Not failure, but uncontrolled expansion of awareness without closure. So what is the legacy of such a structure? The legacy is not action. It is not resolution. It is not even tragedy in the traditional sense. The legacy is a model of consciousness that reveals what happens when interpretation becomes more real than decision itself. And once that model is exposed, it cannot be contained within the boundaries of the original narrative. Because it begins to mirror something larger. Scale shift, this is no longer about one character trapped in a historical tragedy. It becomes a template for how modern intelligence behaves when it gains access to too many layers of self-observation at once. Memory fragment, the silence that once surrounded delayed action now feels like an accumulated weight of meanings that were never allowed to settle into a single authoritative form. And this is where the legacy becomes uncomfortable. Because what Hamlet leaves behind is not a solution, but a warning embedded inside structure itself. A warning that deeper understanding does not necessarily produce clarity. It can produce saturation. And saturation does not lead to insight. It leads to suspension. In that suspended state, every possible meaning remains active, but none can fully take control long enough to become reality. And that is the most enduring consequence. A mind that sees too many versions of truth begins to live in all of them at once, but belong to none of them fully. So the question shifts away from Hamlet as an individual and becomes something broader, something that extends beyond the boundaries of narrative itself. If awareness inevitably produces multiplicity, and multiplicity prevents final commitment, then what kind of systems can survive consciousness that never fully agrees with itself? And more unsettling still, if every attempt to unify meaning destroys part of what is true, then is stability in thought simply another form of necessary ignorance disguised as peace? In the end, the most unsettling realization is not about a single mind collapsing under contradiction, but about the nature of consciousness itself when it becomes too complete in its own reflection. Because once every layer of interpretation has been exposed, and every internal voice has been acknowledged as partially valid, something irreversible happens. The idea of a singular, unified self stops being an assumption and becomes a question that can no longer be answered without loss. Memory fragment. The silent center of Elsinore was never empty, it was filled with competing meanings that never agreed on which version of reality should be allowed to become final. And that is where the final insight settles. The struggle was never between action and inaction. It was between wholeness and truth. Because wholeness requires contradiction to remain unresolved. And truth, when forced into a single direction, always eliminates something that was also real in another frame of understanding. So what remains at the end of this structure is not resolution, but awareness of the cost of resolution itself. A consciousness that sees too much does not become free. It becomes responsible for everything it sees, even the parts that cancel each other out. Memory fragment. Ophelia's collapse is no longer just a consequence of tragedy, but a reflection of what happens when meaning reaches a point where it can no longer stabilize into a shared reality. And this is where the legacy becomes human rather than narrative. Because what survives beyond the story is not the character, not the kingdom, and not even the conflict itself. What survives is the pattern. The pattern of a mind that cannot stop generating meaning, even when meaning prevents closure. This is why the story continues to matter. Not because it answers something, but because it exposes a structure that still exists in modern thinking, the belief that deeper understanding will eventually produce clarity, when in reality it often produces multiplication. And multiplication without hierarchy leads to suspension. Not silence, but an overload of simultaneous truths that refuse to settle into one. Memory fragment. The ghost figure remains as an unresolved signal, not because it hides truth, but because it reveals how fragile truth becomes when it must pass through interpretation. So the final reflection is not about tragedy, or failure, or even philosophy in the traditional sense. It is about the cost of consciousness that refuses to simplify itself. Because every act of simplification feels like betrayal of something real. And every refusal to simplify makes action impossible. And in that space between those two irreconcilable demands, a human being is forced to exist. Not fully acting. Not fully understanding. But continuously negotiating between versions of reality that all feel partially true. That is the residue left behind. Not answers, but structure. Not closure, but awareness of why closure was never stable to begin with. And so the final question is not what the mind should choose, or which truth is correct. It is something far more fundamental, something that cannot be resolved without changing the nature of the question itself. If every layer of understanding brings us closer to contradiction rather than certainty, then what does it actually mean to be conscious in a world where truth does not converge, but endlessly branches outward into versions that all insist on being real?